There's a family you've probably never heard of that made the Sacklers look like amateurs. A dynasty that didn't just profit from addiction, but built an entire empire around it. They didn't hide in the shadows. They operated in plain sight. They weaponized addiction, industrialized it, and turned whole nations into customers. The Sacklers might have made billions off OxyContin, but a century earlier, another family perfected the same playbook. They addicted millions, reshaped economies, and walked away as heroes. They weren't punished. They were knighted. Their names were carved into libraries, hospitals, and universities. This is the story of the Cissoon family, the merchants who turned opium into gold, who helped build modern India and bankrupt China. They were the drug lords of the British Empire, but with one critical difference: their crimes made them respectable. Because that's how every drug empire works. You make your fortune destroying lives. You launder it through charity, and by the time anyone figures it out, you've become untouchable. The Cissoons didn't just addict a people. They addicted an empire. And their story shows how the same pattern repeats again and again, from the opium fields of India to the pill bottles in your cabinet. But to understand how they pulled it off, we have to go back to where it all began. The year is 1832. A family flees Baghdad with nothing but connections, courage, and a sense for opportunity. And what they find in British India will change the world forever. In 1832, a Jewish merchant named David Sissoon fled Baghdad with his family. They were escaping persecution, squeezed by a corrupt governor demanding money and threatening prison. Carrying what little they had, the Sissoons made their way through Iran and finally arrived in Bombay, a British colonial port exploding with trade and opportunity. Bombay was unlike anything David had ever seen. Cotton flowed out, silver poured in, and the British East India Company ruled everything with absolute power. It wasn't just a company. It was a corporate empire, with its own army, its own courts, its own government. And behind every British uniform was a single goal: profit. David Sissoon arrived with no fortune, but he had something far more valuable. He had connections, a deep web of Jewish and Arab merchants across the Middle East built through generations of trust. He had knowledge, an understanding of trade, politics, and how to position himself close to power. And he had timing, because he arrived right as the British were about to solve one of their biggest economic crises by turning India into a factory for drugs. Where most saw chaos, Sissoon saw order. Where most saw empire, he saw opportunity. He realized that the East India Company had built the perfect criminal business, one protected by law and backed by guns. All it needed were partners bold enough to get their hands dirty. And David Sissoon was ready to do exactly that, because what the British were about to unleash on the world wasn't trade. It was addiction on an industrial scale. By the early 1800s, Britain had developed an obsession. Every household, from London mansions to working-class kitchens, was hooked on tea. It wasn't a luxury anymore. It was a necessity. And all of it came from one place: China. But there was a problem. China didn't want anything Britain had to offer. They looked at British wool, iron, and manufactured goods, and simply said no. The only thing they accepted was silver. So every year, mountains of silver left British vaults and flowed into China, creating a massive trade deficit that threatened the empire's financial stability. The British tried everything to fix it. They offered goods, negotiated deals, sent diplomats. But the Chinese emperor didn't care. He saw Britain as a minor, barbarian nation. And the silver drain kept growing, millions of pounds every year. Then came the solution, a plan so profitable and so evil that it would reshape the world. Grow opium in India under British supervision, smuggle it into China, get millions of Chinese addicted, and watch the silver flow back in. It worked perfectly. By the 1830s, British India was producing over 1,500 tons of opium every year. The East India Company controlled every step, from farming to processing to shipping. They taxed it, they regulated it, they profited from it. This wasn't an underground trade, it was official policy. 14% of the entire revenue of British India came from opium. The empire was built on drugs. roads, schools, military salaries, all funded by addiction. And right in the middle of this booming new industry stood David Sissoon, watching it all unfold. He saw what few others did. He realized that this wasn't just trade, it was state-sponsored crime disguised as commerce. And if he played it right, it could make him one of the richest men in Asia. David Sissoon didn't just join the system, he mastered it. While most merchants simply bought opium at auction and shipped it to China, he understood that real power came from control. He wanted every step of the chain. He financed the farmers who grew the poppies, giving them loans so they'd plant drugs instead of food. He owned the warehouses where the opium was stored, all strategically placed near Bombay's ports for fast shipping. He built his own ships, refusing to depend on anyone else's fleet. He even started his own insurance company to protect those shipments, keeping profits within his own circle. From the fields of India to the ports of Canton, the Cissoons controlled everything. Their agents operated in every major city, speaking local languages, bribing officials, and navigating both British and Chinese systems. And through it all, they had the protection of the British Empire. Because the Cissoons weren't rebels. They were collaborators, perfect partners for an empire that wanted the money but not the blame. By 1836, the Sissoon Company was shipping over 30,000 chests of opium every year. Each chest weighed more than 100 pounds. That's more than 3 million pounds of narcotics flooding into China annually, legally. By the 1850s, that number had doubled. The human cost was catastrophic. Entire villages in China collapsed into addiction. Fathers smoked themselves into oblivion while their children starved. Workshops closed. Farms failed. Silver bled out of China and back into British and Sissoon hands, and all of it was done under the banner of free trade. This was the first industrial drug empire in modern history, and it wasn't run by criminals in hiding. It was run by businessmen celebrated in British newspapers and knighted by the crown. David Sissoon became a hero in Bombay, known not as a trafficker, but as a generous benefactor. He donated to schools and synagogues, funded hospitals, and walked the streets as a symbol of success. But while he was being praised, China was dying. And one man finally decided to fight back. By 1839, China had reached its breaking point. Addiction was tearing the country apart. The economy was bleeding silver. Entire communities were collapsing. So the emperor made a decision. Enough was enough. He sent one man to end the opium crisis. His name was Lin Zexu, an incorruptible official, intelligent, disciplined, and fearless. When Lin arrived in Canton, the heart of the opium trade, he didn't negotiate. He surrounded the foreign warehouses and demanded every ounce of opium be surrendered. The merchants resisted. They pleaded, stalled, and bribed. Lin didn't care. He seized over 1,400 tons of opium and destroyed it all. Publicly. He mixed it with lime and salt and dumped it into the sea. It was a statement to the world. China would no longer be poisoned. Lin even wrote to Queen Victoria. He asked a simple question. If opium was illegal and dangerous in Britain, why was it acceptable to sell it in China? Why was it moral to poison foreign citizens for profit? The British government never answered. Instead, they sent warships. In 1839, the First Opium War began. 16 British gunboats sailed toward China, armed with cannons and the latest steam technology. It wasn't a war. It was a massacre. The Chinese Navy was outdated and underprepared. British ships destroyed coastal defenses, blockaded ports, and forced China to surrender. The result was the Treaty of Nanking in 1842, one of the most humiliating deals in Chinese history. China had to pay 21 million silver dollars for the destroyed opium. They had to open 5 new ports for trade. They had to hand over Hong Kong to Britain. And British citizens were now immune from Chinese law. The opium trade wasn't made legal, but it didn't have to be. The floodgates were open, and the Cissoons, who had backed Britain with ships, supplies, and money, got first access to the new markets. China had been defeated. The British had their profits. And David Sissoon had just secured his place as one of the most powerful men in Asia. But China wasn't done fighting. Because less than 20 years later, the empire would strike back, and Britain would answer with even greater brutality. By the 1850s, China was desperate to regain control. Officials tried once again to crack down on opium dealers and enforce the bans. But Britain saw this as an insult to their right to trade, and this time they weren't coming alone. France joined the fight, hungry for its own share of China's markets. What followed was pure devastation. British and French forces stormed Chinese ports, crushed local resistance, and marched straight to Beijing. They didn't just win, they humiliated a civilization. The old Summer Palace, one of China's most extraordinary architectural treasures, was looted and burned to the ground. Priceless art, manuscripts, and jewels were stolen or destroyed in days. It wasn't just war, it was cultural annihilation. When the smoke cleared, China had no choice but to surrender again. The Treaty of Tianjin in 1860 did what the First War never officially said out loud. It legalized opium. From that moment, addiction became law. The British and the Cissoons could now flood the Chinese market openly, under full legal protection. And they did. By the 1860s, the Cissoon Empire had become one of the largest private merchant networks in all of Asia. They weren't just trading opium anymore. They had diversified into cotton, tea, silk, and banking. They built shipping companies, opened factories, and invested in railroads and telegraph lines. Every rupee made from drugs was reinvested into something legitimate. This was how you turned blood money into respectability. You didn't hide it. You built on top of it. You made yourself indispensable to the system so that no one could question where the money came from. David Sissoon had become Bombay's golden name, the model of success under the British Empire. But he wasn't just chasing wealth. He was chasing legacy. He understood that the one thing more powerful than money was reputation. And he was about to buy his way into history. By the late 1800s, David Sissoon and his sons had perfected the art of transformation. They had taken the dirtiest money on earth and turned it into monuments of respectability. Every dock, library, and hospital they built wasn't just charity. It was a shield, a way to rewrite history while it was still happening. In 1847, David funded the Grand David Sissoon Library and Reading Room in Bombay, a landmark that still stands today. He donated money to build the Sissoon Dock, one of the city's most important ports. He funded schools, hospitals, and orphanages. Everywhere you looked, the Sissoon name gleamed in stone and marble. To the people of Bombay, he was a generous hero. To the British, he was proof that their empire worked, that anyone, no matter their background, could prosper under their rule. No one dared to question where the fortune came from. By 1853, the British government rewarded him with the title of Sheriff of Bombay, a ceremonial position, but one that made his power official. When David died, his son Albert took over and went even further. Albert was knighted by the British Empire in 1872 and became the first Jewish man ever granted the freedom of the City of London. Not even the Rothschilds had received that honor. The Sissoons had become more respectable than the Rothschilds, and their wealth was built on addiction. This was their genius. They didn't run from the truth. They buried it under good deeds. Every building, every donation, every scholarship became a layer of insulation between their fortune and its origins. By the time history looked back, the Opium Empire had turned into a philanthropic dynasty. But time doesn't stop. Empires rise and fall. And the Sissoons were about to learn that no fortune, no matter how powerful, lasts forever. By the early 1900s, the Sissoon Empire was everywhere. Their businesses stretched from Bombay to Shanghai, from Hong Kong to London. But like every empire built on greed, cracks began to show. The opium trade was fading, new governments were rising, and the tides of history were shifting against them. In 1949, everything changed. The Chinese Communist Party seized power after winning the Civil War, and one of their first moves was to reclaim everything foreign hands had taken. Every Sissoon building, every factory, every bank in Shanghai was seized overnight. Gone. No compensation, no appeal. A century of empire vanished in a single decree. Victor Sissoon, the last heir to the family fortune, fled with whatever gold and papers he could carry. He escaped to the Bahamas, watching from afar as the empire his ancestors built turned to dust. The family that once controlled 70% of the world's opium trade had lost it all. Not to law or justice, but to revolution. The irony was brutal. They had addicted China, and now China had expelled them. The same nation they once poisoned had risen up and erased them from its story. Back in England, their fortunes didn't survive much longer either. By the 1930s, their company was collapsing under bad management. By the 1980s, what was left of it was declared unfit to operate by the British government. The once mighty Cissoon name faded into obscurity. The docks and libraries in Mumbai remained, but the people who built them were forgotten. The empire that once ruled trade, politics, and addiction ended quietly, not with violence or scandal, but with silence. History buried their crimes beneath marble plaques and respectable titles, but their story didn't really end. Because the model they created, to profit from suffering and hide behind philanthropy, survived. And a new family, a century later, would copy their playbook almost word for word. A century after the Cissoons collapsed, another family rose to take their place. Different time, different drug, same blueprint. Their name was Sackler, and their empire would rewrite the story of addiction in America. Through Purdue Pharma, the Sacklers unleashed OxyContin, a prescription painkiller marketed as safe, effective, and non-addictive. But it wasn't. It was opium in a new form, hidden under the mask of modern medicine. And just like the Cissoons, they built their fortune by turning human suffering into profit. Over 500,000 Americans would die in the opioid epidemic. Entire towns collapsed into dependency. And the Sacklers made more than $20 billion before anyone stopped them. When the truth came out, they did what every dynasty does. They paid fines, declared bankruptcy, and donated just enough to appear remorseful. $4.5 billion in settlements, a fraction of their total wealth. They lost their reputation but kept most of the money. Museums began removing their name, the Louvre, the Tate, the Met. The same way future generations might one day look at the Sissoon Library, unaware of what funded it, but the Sacklers weren't the only ones. Behind them were corporations like Johnson & Johnson, McKesson, Cardinal Health, companies that shipped billions of pills into small towns, knowing exactly what would happen. The FDA approved them, doctors overprescribed them, regulators looked away, and even after the bodies piled up, the system stayed intact. The fines were paid, the shareholders moved on, the companies kept operating. Because in the end, addiction isn't a crime when it's profitable, it's just business. The playbook hasn't changed since the days of the Cissoons. Industrialize addiction, legalize it, hide behind charity, and when the truth comes out, pivot, rebrand, and repeat. History has a short memory. The Cissoons built their empire on opium and were remembered as philanthropists. The Sacklers did the same with opioids and were celebrated as medical visionaries, until they weren't. And the next family running the same playbook is already out there, hiding behind the same polished smiles and charitable donations. This is how the cycle works. You build an empire on addiction. You launder the profits through hospitals, museums, and universities. You buy silence. And you let time turn your crimes into legacy, because every empire built on human suffering eventually collapses, but never before it's made its fortune. The Cissoons turned China into a nation of addicts. The Sacklers turned pain into profit. And now, pharmaceutical giants do the same with antidepressants, ADHD meds, and drugs designed to be taken for life. Addiction isn't just a side effect anymore. It's a business model, a system that rewards dependency and calls it treatment. The goal isn't to cure, it's to keep you coming back. And the same institutions that profit from this cycle are the ones that build your hospitals, fund your research, and educate your doctors. It's respectability built on blood. So when you see a family name on a library or a hospital wing, ask where the money came from. Because chances are, somewhere along the line, it came from pain. The Sissoons' docks still stand in Mumbai. The Sacklers' money still sits in trusts. The buildings remain, the names endure, and the people who suffered are forgotten. That's how the story always ends. You make your fortune from human suffering. You donate enough to wash your hands. And then you wait for time to turn your crimes into history. By the time the truth surfaces, you're gone. Your family is rich, and the world calls you generous. That's the real empire, not built on power or glory, but on addiction so deep it outlives the people who caused it.